think we're ready to get started here.
Yes.
1920s in Paris, and then came to the States 1935, where it was renamed the Red Snapper because Bloody Mary was considered to be a very rude name. That's all bullshit. Yeah, it's not true.
See?
That part. What is true is in 1928, in New York, they were already mixing gin and tomato juice as a hangover cure, according to O.O. McIntyre, who was a syndicated columnist at the time. The name Red Snapper actually comes from the brand of premix that Pete Petio used, because he was just combining the gin or vodka with Red Snapper.
But you didn't mention who named the Bloody Mary the Bloody Mary.
I didn't, but I have the ultimate proof of what I'm saying. Here's an empty bottle of Red Snapper brand premix. You guys can pass around and have a look.
A bottle of that with booze, and you had it. But the name Bloody Mary was given by the piano player who played downstairs at the New York Bar, which was not called Harry's New York Bar at the time, it was just the New York Bar. And his name was Roy Barton. And he was a jazz pianist from New Orleans who made it from New Orleans to Chicago just before Prohibition. And he moved because he was unemployed after Prohibition, and he moved to Paris and fell in love with a young lady.
But this gets even more complicated because, you know, I'm sure you all know the Bloody Caesar, the one made with Clamato juice. Now, when was that drink invented? Well, late 1800s, early 1900s actually, not the 1969 at the Calgary Hilton, because the Red Snapper brand premix was a spicy blend of tomato and clam. So this was actually already around and being mixed with spirits. So that's the truth of the birth of the Bloody Caesar as well. It gets complicated when you try to do history, doesn't it?
Yeah, it gets really complicated, especially when we're still trying to figure out points of history.
Yeah.
But there you go.
But they told us we were going to be doing Prohibition in 40 minutes.
Yeah, so then the question is, well, we have to wait until we get
a microphone.
But when we get a microphone, we can get started.
Prohibition in 40 minutes is going to be an interesting one.
We're not going to have the microphone? Oh dear, we're going to have Rolando voices.
We've got 41 slides here. And
we're going to go fast. That's what we're going to do.
We could do at least 6 hours comfortably on this, just to get warmed up on the subject.
Shall we start?
So you're going to hear a lot of her telling me to shut up.
Yeah, it's okay. So, Babis, what do you think?
Oh, we're still waiting for a microphone.
Still waiting for a microphone.
No, you can start.
Oh,
well, these guys said give them 5 minutes for a microphone.
No, you can start.
Okay.
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 Okay, everybody, do you agree? Should we start? Good, okay. Okay. Then we're good. Okay. So, let's talk. Okay, so, Prohibition. Reason why Prohibition happened. It was long, long before, way before the turn of the century. Actually, the problem was this. From the day that the British colonists arrived and the Dutch colonists arrived in the 1600s, they were drinking like crazy. From the minute they woke up to the second they went to sleep. To a point that before 1845, each and every American who had to wake up in the morning and do anything was drinking about 7 gallons of alcohol a year. How's that one?
So there was a good reason why Prohibition happened. People were actually
drinking
far
themselves.
Too much. They were drinking themselves to death.
To a point that the only things that really changed people's minds, which is why by 1845 people did change their minds about drinking, was because a man named Benjamin Rush, he didn't want to prohibit alcohol. He just wanted to kind of convince people that you don't give a baby 30 mils of whiskey first thing in the morning. Yeah, okay, that makes good sense.
But in the 1850s, something very significant happened. Mm-hmm. It was the first time that charcoal filtration was introduced in households for water.
Well, you could actually drink the water for the first time. It took till the 1850s before we could drink water. Think about it. Otherwise, it was too dangerous. You get cholera, you get typhus, people died left and right.
E. coli.
E. coli, salmonella.
And the only way to avoid that previously was to drink alcohol.
Yeah. And then, because all of a sudden you could drink water instead of alcohol all the time, a man by the name of Lyman Beecher decided not to cut back on the alcohol, but he decided that the devil was in the bottle. And so everybody had to quit drinking. And he was going to tell the entire United States, every good religious person had to stop drinking.
And it worked.
And it worked.
And July 4th, 1855, in New York, they were celebrating Prohibition.
Yeah.
But this was done next, state by state.
Yeah.
And
Maine was the first.
yeah, in blue, these are the states that were dry. Yellow, at this time, these were still wet, and these were done by local. They were done by city, by county. By 1900, by 1905, these were all green. So there was prohibition all across the country. So prohibition didn't just happen on the 15th of January 1920. It happened gradually.
Very gradually. A little bit of politics, you know, that's because you had good religious right, wanted everybody to stop drinking, but it didn't happen for certain until women wanted the vote, and women wanted to make sure that they controlled everything, to be honest. 1874 was the first time it happened. What was it, your childhood friend's
Oh yes, this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yes, this lady
who
here,
was
amazing lady.
very famous in U.S. history for her work as a feminist, but also for temperance. And it's ironic that her great-great-grandson was my childhood best friend. My great-grandparents were producing beer during Prohibition on one side, and on the other side, my grandfather was doing a bit of rum running across the Canadian border.
Nasty. But women decided, you know, that domestic violence and child abuse and poverty, it was all alcohol's fault. Good way to get the vote, right? Is just tell everybody, if you quit drinking, then you'll let us vote, and then we'll be okay.
But there were other things that they were working on, and one was family values and stopping child abuse. And in 1875, there was this story printed in the newspapers about a father whose child approached him when he was busy and he was concentrating. And the child said, "What are you doing, father?" And the father turned and shouted at the child. And the child implored him, "Speak easy, father," which meant be gentle with me, don't be confrontational. And that appeared in newspapers for about 10 years. And that, in truth, is the birth of the term speakeasy.
Because then the term, also in Pennsylvania within the same year, people started using speakeasy as a way of saying, you're coming to this bar, it's an illicit bar.
You've jumped ahead.
Oh, I have jumped ahead.
You have. Because before that...
Same year. Was the same year.
The term meant something else.
Yeah.
And the Americans were in danger of becoming a nation of speakeasies.
Yes.
Because they were considered to be non-confrontational and would walk away from any conflict rather than becoming involved.
But then they used it because people would go to illicit bars in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia. Huh?
1880s.
No, it was before then. No, it was in the 1870s. That people would go to a bar and they would be a little loud, which happens even these days. It was a little loud, so they would say, "Would you please speak easy when you leave?"
Which meant, please don't have arguments. Please be a speakeasy.
Yeah, exactly. Now we finished explaining the logic of speakeasy.
There
Good,
we go.
great. But then there were a lot of illegal bars at the time because they were trying to regulate the amount of alcohol that was sold, the amount of alcohol was consumed.
But you didn't need a license to give alcohol away.
No.
So what bars would do is, without a license, they'd say, oh, come pay $1 or a quarter to see the blind pig.
Or the blind tiger.
Or the blind tiger. While you're here, have a free drink.
Yeah. Or the other one that we didn't even put on here is free lunch. The idea was that you're paying for lunch, but lunch meant mainly whatever sandwiches that the bartender decided to put on the bar, but you're paying for actual drinks, but it was just called lunch. And free lunch was sometimes those sandwiches were 5 and 6 days old because nobody was eating the sandwiches, but everybody was going for lunch. It was really kind of funny. There was another reason why in America the public tide, started to change against drinking alcohol. And it was because most of the bars were owned by German or Irish bar owners. And unfortunately, it was during a time when the United States didn't particularly like the idea of immigrants coming in, let alone the fact that they all seemed to own the bars. So they literally called them enemy aliens.
What's it take to get a drink around here anyway?
How do you get a drink around here? Can I have one? Oh, thank you. Okay. Just an example. You have to think about Harry Johnson. This is the infamous Harry Johnson. Thank you. He was famous for his ability to operate a bar. He had sold tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books during the 1880s. Everybody knew who he was. Willie Schmidt, all of these guys were some of the best known, close quote, American bartenders in the world. But they were Germans. And so the forthright, purist Americans just didn't know what the hell was going on. They just went, no, forget it, you're an alien. Irish saloon keepers were all considered to be thieves and nefarious, and that's the way they did it. Oh, this. You mean this? Have you ever had a Fluffy Ruffles before? No, I guess not. This is a Fluffy Ruffles. This is Prohibition time drink. Prohibition time drinks, surprisingly, a lot of them were to disguise booze. Today we're just going to have to try 2 samples of 2 where they did not have to disguise the booze for one reason. The one most successful spirit during the entire Prohibition era, rum. It was.
And one of the worst drink names in
Fluffy
the history
Ruffles?
of drink, the Fluffy Ruffles.
Yeah, well, you know how it goes. So anyways, during World War I, we did have a problem where people went, oh, so if all the bar owners are cousins to the enemy Hun during the First World War,
well, this
let's
was
not go
just
there.
propaganda by the temperance movement
Yeah.
to build support for prohibition. Another thing that they used was the shortage of grain during the war.
Yeah.
Because there weren't people out in the farm fields, there wasn't as much grain production, and all of the grain was being sent overseas for the war effort. So they said, we cannot use that grain to make alcohol. Well, the war ended before the act was put through to make a wartime prohibition.
Well, considering America didn't enter the First World War until the last 6 months of the First World War, of course it took them a while to get the prohibition going.
And then after the war ended, the Wartime Prohibition Act went through. And the 1st of July, 1919, became known as the Thirsty First, because it was at this point that Prohibition began in the United States. It was 1st of July, 1919. You could no longer purchase or produce any alcoholic beverage over 2.75% ABV.
Once they had managed this, based on an excuse of it being the war, it didn't take much for the suffragettes and the people who supported the idea of women's right to vote to couple up prohibition with women's right to vote in the next election, which also took place right around the same period of time. Woodrow Wilson was against the idea of prohibition. He was out by 1919. You now had all these women who said, oh, if we get rid of drinking, this is going to be the end of it. This is wonderful. It's done. It was done. And the great experiment began. 18th Amendment was enforced officially on the 16th of January. What happened before the 16th of January?
Well, on the 15th of January, in Boston, they discovered how fast molasses moves in January, which is an American expression for slow, is as fast as molasses in January. In truth, molasses moves 35 miles an hour because a 2.5 million gallon tank of molasses that was destined to be distilled into alcohol burst in Boston, sending a sticky wave across the back bay and into the water.
How many cars did it eat? How many trains did it eat?
It knocked down a train trestle after the train had passed over.
Yeah.
It's estimated that 72 people lost their lives in this disaster, and that you could still smell the molasses on hot days up to the 1960s in Boston.
It was true. The whole
Next
back
day
bay
at noon,
smelled
the
it.
church bells rang across Boston, not in mourning, but in celebration of what had happened in Nebraska. It was because Nebraska that day became the 36th state to ratify the 18th Amendment, ushering in Prohibition next year.
So where did all the booze go? Where did all the people go? Well, they went not to Canada, where they could have gone across the border easily and just had some
Except
whiskey.
Canada was fiddling around with the idea of prohibition as well, and had prohibition for a couple of years.
And you could have gone to Mexico, except they were still having problems like Pancho Villa and other things. They were having little revolutionary problems. People didn't feel too safe about going to Mexico and drinking rum.
Plus, to be honest, the alcohol quality in your average Mexican bar was not nearly as good as it is today.
No, no. But instead they went to Cuba, of course, and they went to Europe.
Absolutely love how they got to Cuba. And
Yeah.
this plane actually did flights from Detroit and Cincinnati to Cuba. The pilots are here. This is actually a passenger sticking their head out from the porthole on the front in flight. If you wanted to
dangerous
look
place to sit.
outside, you could just open that up, go look around.
But this pairing down here was probably the most famous way to get to Cuba from New York and anywhere along the East Coast. It was called the Havana Special. It was a combination. You took a train from Pennsylvania Station all the way down to Miami. In Miami, you picked up a ferry. The ferry would then
The train
take
actually went right to the water's edge, and you
Yeah.
literally just stepped off the train onto the boat.
Yeah, and then the ferry would take you into Havana Harbor.
About 6 hours.
No, eventually it was 6 hours when they finally added on the additional train tracks
Oh,
from
no, I mean
Miami
the ferry.
from Miami to Key West. Then it was 6 hours. It's only 90
okay.
miles. There was another good term that came out at the time because this also gave people a good hint. If you could go to an island, why not just go to the international limit, which was the 3-mile limit? 3 miles outside of America, you could get on a cruise ship and they break out the booze. It's really kind of fun like that. You could go on a party boat. That was another good
Or,
term like that.
if you'd had a little bit of forethought, you could simply stay at home and drink all you wanted.
I mean, like this poor man who lost a whole bunch.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, there was nothing against holding on to booze so long as you bought it before Prohibition started.
yeah, this guy had socked away $300,000 in alcohol in his cellar before Prohibition, which you could do, and a lot of people did.
Including the United States President. The United States President during the 1920s, before Prohibition started, right after Woodrow Wilson left, came into the White House and stocked the entire cellar with barrels of scotch from Scotland. Barrels of it, so he could entertain everybody who came to see him. No problem.
Now, the largest theft from a private cellar that I came across was this one poor guy lost 72 barrels of whiskey that he bought and put in his cellar.
That's a lot of whiskey to lose. That's not fun. Another good, great term that came along, rum running. What did it really mean? Rum running technically was people would go out to the 3-mile limit with their boats. They would meet a ship that had barrels of rum from Puerto Rico, from Jamaica, from Cuba predominantly, and they would run it in. They used to get caught every once in a while, but not that often.
It was hard to catch them. This was the birth of speedboats.
Yeah.
The speed record for a boat set in 1924 was 60 miles an hour. Yeah. So they actually had the first cigarette boats at this time.
And it wasn't just the Caribbean either, because in California, just across the bay from San Francisco in Marin County, there's one town, Tiburon, that's sort of off on the side. Nobody really notices it too much. And they used to have rum running from there. And where they were running the rum from was Jalisco, Mexico, which used to be a major rum producer before it was a major tequila producer. So the rum running was happening from two different sides, and two major amounts of rum just coming up from the south. Anybody who could get in would bring it in by any kind of boat that they could and still kept on making money.
But it was also very easy on the Canadian border. In winter, you could just drive it across the ice.
Well, it all depends on how well you could drive in the wintertime.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay.
If you tried to do it in the spring, it could be a problem. But in the dead of winter, they were just driving trucks across the Detroit River. And actually, at this spot in the Detroit River, Detroit is north of Walkerville, Canada.
And it's only 1 mile.
Juxtaposition.
It's a 1 mile drive, or a 1 mile boat.
Across the river?
Yeah. Nah.
Even less.
Even less?
Yeah.
Ooh, let's make it scary.
Yeah. At that point in Walkerville, Ontario, is North America's largest distillery.
It is.
The Canadian Club Distillery,
Yeah.
with fermenting vats the size of upturned school buses. It's an amazing sight.
Yeah.
Did you by any chance put the rack house image in here? You didn't?
No, I miss the rack house. Wow. I miss the rack house. But let's talk about what people were doing who couldn't go to another country, who didn't know anybody who so happenly was rum running somewhere.
Or all of those poor people who, on hearing Prohibition was going to go into effect, went out and bought a case of whiskey.
As if a case was going to do you any good after a while. Well, you know, you had to do something. So some people, of course, already had a profession, especially in Middle America, which was using homemade stills. Good tradition from the Scots-Irish. You know, they knew how to do it right, and they even used car radiators to make these things. The other good excuse was you could still get wine, low-level wine, if you could prove that you needed it for your church services, communions, in the case of kosher wine, for sacramental purposes for Passover. You could always do something somehow to get some kind of something. And then there would be people who confiscate it and other people who had to test it. John Bonner was the official federal tester to see what sort of illegal closed-quote spirits were being done. By 1922, he had already sampled 26,000 samples of illegal booze. Never mind. Anyways. And it was funny because he decided after when he was interviewed, and he admitted he'd done 26,000 samples, he said Peoria, Illinois had the best illegal stills in the whole country. It's good to know you got a recommendation from somebody who knew what was going on.
We just talked about bootlegging without saying where it came from.
Well, we should probably say that it'll be coming up in a second, but let's look at boots first. And,
Well,
you know, when you had your illegal booze, of course, you preferably had a wife or a girlfriend who was willing to transport some of it for you. I mean, there was one way of getting it. I love the cane. I want one of these. I want one of these canes. I want a cane flask. It's a good way of doing it. Of course, then, if you had a reputable bootlegger, he had a price list.
Now, by 1930, no one was paying attention to the Prohibition law. Sure, you could get arrested, so you paid off the policeman. usually with alcohol. They were okay with that.
Hey, if you could get Hennessy for $44 a case.
But you notice the phone number is stamped on where the rest of it is done properly printed. And that's so that he would just stamp his phone number on. If that phone got busted, he could just put a new phone number on, no problem.
Well, you know, if you have to move around, you have to move around. You know how that works. You also
the
could go...
speakeasies got so organized that you had membership cards. You'd just go up to the window, show your card, and go straight in.
Well, in the case of Cotton Club was probably the most famous for really bringing jazz to the public eye. I mean, beyond going to deeper, darker sides of the country, like New Orleans, Storyville, or going into Harlem. At least with Cotton Club, you go into Harlem, you could have a great drink, you could listen to Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Billie Holiday. So you got your fill of jazz and you got your fill of booze at the same time. The Store Club, you got, hey, it's kind of like A-lister time. If you wanted to go rub shoulders with the New York City mayor, every single actor and actress in Hollywood, you went to the Store Club. It was phenomenal how everybody seemed to know about this. And the owners were just as colorful. Texas Guinan was an amazing woman. She owned a speakeasy, but she was also one of the lead singers with her orchestra in her own speakeasy.
Well, her speakeasy had a whole orchestra, cabaret.
Dancers, the whole works. Jack and Charlie, 21 Club still exists in New York. They started out in Greenwich Village. They had to move a couple of times, but Jack and Charlie definitely made their reputation. Again, the New York City mayor got arrested drinking in their speakeasy, and for some reason they didn't get arrested and they didn't get their speakeasy closed down. Well, all the way through Prohibition.
Well, they got raided a number of times, but they were never caught with a single bottle of alcohol in the establishment, because at the start of a raid, there was a man posted by the door. He would press a button, that would ring to the bartender, who pressed a button, and the back bar shelves would all drop, and all the bottles would go down a chute and into a secret space in the building next door.
Nice. Now, who's this guy, Joe? We can talk about Joe sent me?
Yeah.
Did Joe send you?
If you've ever heard that speakeasy expression, Joe sent me, well, this is Joe. Joe Marquis Madden was one of the most famous of the speakeasy owners of New York. He's all but forgotten today, sadly. His place was on 52nd Street between 6th and 7th. 52nd between 5th and 6th was considered the wettest place. Oh no, he was between 5th and 6th.
He was between 5th and 6th.
Was considered the wettest street in America. New York today has something like 8,000 bars.
Yeah, well, it had 10,000.
12,000 bars.
Yeah.
At this time, there were roughly 100,000 places where you could go and buy a drink.
Yeah, somebody's basement, somebody's apartment.
On 52nd Street, it was said if you knocked on any door on that street, you could buy a drink.
And this is what it looked like on the inside. I mean, most of these places looked like they were restaurants. They were fairly reasonable, well, except for the Store Club, which wasn't so reasonable looking. It was pretty amazing. Store Club had its own still. When they finally gutted out the old Store Club building, they actually found a working still behind one of the hollow walls. So when they ran out, and if they couldn't get a rum run, they'd just make their own. Makes sense. And you see, it was pretty easy to make your own, actually, because if you had a source of neutral spirit somehow, all you had to do to make brandy was go to the local grocery shop and pick up a bottle of imitation brandy extract or imitation rum.
And the term bathtub gin comes from this as well, from people buying gin flavoring, and then to fill a jug that had neutral spirit and gin flavoring with the water to cut it to proof, they would hold it under the bath tap. because that was generally taller than the kitchen tap and easier to work with. So that was bathtub gin.
But then there was also things like Kumtuk's non-intoxicating beer. That was a fun one. Healthful, refreshing, invigorating, non-intoxicating beer.
Well, that was how the breweries stayed in business. Was the breweries were allowed to make beer up to 0.5% alcohol.
Which Canada still has a lot of breweries that still have the recipes for doing that, and they still sell the stuff.
Oh yeah, and what my family did was we produced beer and then simply labeled it as non-alcoholic beer. And where Chicago had Al Capone selling Canadian whiskey, New York had Dutch Schultz selling Seitz beer from Easton, Pennsylvania that my family was providing.
But then you could also just go to the local shop and buy your malt extracts and your Angus.
Well, this is all
bitters
hops
and hops.
being sold in the shop.
Yeah.
Let's see, there are grape syrups for making wine, a bunch of yeasts here, and don't forget Angostura bitters.
So long as you did not sell it to anyone else, including your neighbor, you could make your own stuff at home. No one said you couldn't. They just said you couldn't sell it. And you couldn't transport it outside of your house.
Remember when we tried to buy a bottle of Angostura bitters in Vancouver? We wandered all around the big grocery store. There's Chinese cooking wine, which is just neutral alcohol, water and salt, other things, but no Angostura. Finally asked the cashier. I said, oh, you want Angostura? I'll get the manager. Manager comes over, you want a bottle of Angostura? Yes. And he goes over and he unlocks this case and he takes a bottle out and he hands it to the cashier and she rings it up and puts it in our bag. So, what was that all about? She, oh, we've had a big problem with people. They come in because that's high alcohol. They break it open and then they just down that bottle. Like, these people should be easy to spot.
You're writhing on the floor in agony. Oh, God. They have a competition in Trinidad to see who's brave enough to drink a whole bottle. Give me a break. You could, though, get a prescription. You could get a prescription for whiskey.
The easiest way to drink if you hadn't stocked up.
If you had the money.
These prescriptions were only good for a week, so a lot of people spent a lot of time at the doctor during Prohibition to cure what ailed them. And I've seen these prescriptions written for...
This one is whiskey 3 times a day.
With meals.
With meals.
And it doesn't say what this one is to treat.
Oh, it doesn't say what's to treat.
But I have seen these written for flu, cold, cough, lumbago, the vapors. Ennui was a great one. Basically saying, oh, this is to treat boredom.
Yeah, okay. But for medicinal purposes only, you could buy pure rye whiskey to cure what ails you.
Or you could get a prescription for gin. I have seen one prescription for champagne as well.
Now that must have been a peculiar disease if champagne was going to help. You really had to wonder. Oh, but you could.
Oh, you did that already. Go ahead.
Yeah. You could go and buy Fernet Branca. You could buy Campari. They
weren't banned during Prohibition.
No, Amaros were considered to be medicinal. To the American taste buds, they were medicinal. So nobody in their right minds would drink a shot of Fernet Branca. Humph. But there was also dangerous stuff like Jamaica ginger. Jamaica ginger was one of the great tragedies of Prohibition. A couple of young enterprising men thought, well, you have this ginger-based alcohol stuff. The U.S. government said, well, if you add more ginger to it, people won't drink it. What unfortunately they didn't realize was the base alcohol that these guys were using was lethal. It had way too much of every single negative tale in the world, and people with J-plague ended up...
There was a preservative compound that had been considered to be safe.
Wasn't.
And they did not know that it was unsafe at this time. And it was not discovered till this had killed 50,000 people.
Yeah, 50,000 people and permanently crippled hundreds, thousands more. They actually were still suing people.
And the reason it went so far is because it was killing off
Yeah.
Minorities, it was not noticed. In fact, it wasn't until a doctor came down with Jake Leg, and there's a ton of songs about it from the era. Jake Leg Boogie, Jake Leg Blues.
Well, it's because your muscles would actually fall apart. They would completely lose control. So you'd be like walking like that. And it actually did affect hundreds of thousands of people who did try to sue.
It is one of the saddest stories to come out of Prohibition.
Oh, here's one of the funny ones then.
Oh, yeah. Before Prohibition was enacted, there was a survey held to find out what they would name the camel in the Central Park Zoo. It was a new camel that was born, and they named it Prohibition, and its parents were named Mr. and Mrs. Volstead. Mr. and Mrs. Volstead had another baby camel a couple of years later, and they held a poll to see what it was going to be named, and it was named Bootlegger.
Got the impression that the world just so happily was really not very amused with Prohibition.
And for good reason. Look at the crime statistics.
Look at this. It's like
Prohibition
literally...
was supposed to stop crime.
Yeah, well, the rate of crime...
This is murders and assaults with a gun.
1921 to 1933 was just insane. Organized crime had completely taken over. People were just... They lost it all. There were no family values at that point. Well, it didn't help. There was also at the dawn of what became one of those big bubbles,
this just
financial
says it,
bubbles.
doesn't it?
It does. It says it all.
Yeah.
So eventually, the women who had voted for Prohibition started pleading for the end of Prohibition.
I don't recall you mentioning about the suffragettes at the beginning, did you?
Yes, I did.
You did?
Yes.
Okay.
And they were the first ones to start campaigning and saying, we have got to get rid of Prohibition. Look, there's crime in the streets, and there's child abuse, and women are getting hurt. And wait a minute, you said that about alcohol. Now you're saying it because of lack of alcohol, that they're all... Okay, great. Make up your minds, okay?
Well, they did. They wanted the right to vote, and they got it.
Well, they got the right to vote. Good for them. They got the right to vote. So luckily, they also voted properly when they finally ended Prohibition. We still don't know if it was President Roosevelt who stirred the first martini at midnight, or a journalist who might have preempted him.
But we do know who ran the first loads of Scotch whiskey in.
Yes, Joseph P. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's father.
And his business partner.
Shefflin.
And Roosevelt.
And Roosevelt.
President Roosevelt's son was actually involved in the whiskey business. With John F. Kennedy's father, and the two of them had ships sitting off the 3-mile limit, ready to come flooding in. This is actually a Washington, D.C. delicatessen, the first place to get a liquor license after repeal.
But somehow, excuse me, isn't a delicatessen supposed to have cheeses and meats in the window?
Yeah, it's all booze.
Okay, never mind. Okay, never mind.
All booze. My favorite, right in the middle, is one that I've never heard of, is Canada Dry Gin.
Canada Dry Gin. Well, you know, you have something. Mm-hmm. So, okay, who were the repeals winners? Who actually were the first people to come out of the box and say, okay, we've got booze, it's ready for you, let's go for it again? Canada, of course, hadn't stopped producing all this time. Thanks to Joseph P. Kennedy and the Shefflins and Roosevelt, Scotch came in. It had been sitting out in the 3-mile limit.
And they'd been building up investors in whiskey futures and buying.
They had 25 million invested by 1927. 25 million that they could buy whiskey from.
And so they literally had a fleet of ships sitting offshore, waiting for the moment that repeal went through, and then just sailed them straight in.
And rum made leaps and bounds. I mean, to a point that rum, even by the Second World War, they couldn't get rid of the amount of rum they had. I mean, there was that much rum.
But there were a few spirits that got decimated by Prohibition.
Well, American whiskey definitely decimated by Prohibition. Irish whiskey, the problem was at another fault, which was the Irish Revolution from 1917 to 1922 had shut down whiskey distilleries throughout Ireland. they needed to come back up as soon as and get started again once the revolution was over. Well, there was only one problem. The major purchaser, America, just wasn't there. So they
And
didn't really
the
recover
Irish
it.
distilleries did not get the same inside information
Yeah.
that went to the Scots. And so they were blindsided by repeal, where the Scots had been building up extra stock.
Now, you see, the reason why American whiskey, of course, didn't make it as easily, and in fact, it took until the 1960s before it did officially recuperate, was because right after repeal, literally the same year, months afterwards, the Dust Bowl hit the Midwest. There was no grain.
What had happened was with
It was
the
gone.
introduction of mechanized agriculture, the use of the tractor, they could plow much larger fields, and so they took down all the hedgerows and began running these tractors in fields that would run to the horizon. When the drought hit, there was no windbreaks to stop that soil from just being lifted up, and the soil from Nebraska literally ended up on top of the White House in Washington and out into the Atlantic Ocean.
And so if you wonder where, where whiskey came from, truth is my father was working in the United States in the 1940s. His first job when he arrived for a certain company, bourbon company, was to buy potatoes to make bourbon. Yes, you made potatoes as bourbon. Yeah, doesn't taste good. Same problem with gin, believe it or not. The UK suffered from the same thing. So there was a grain shortage that led England to make gin with beet sugar. So from the time of end of Prohibition through the Second World War, okay, there were grain shortages again. The alcohol industry did not recoup to what it originally was, using grains and all the original grains they were doing until 1961, 1964. In fact, Plymouth Gin was so proud of it when they finally started using grain to make Plymouth Gin again in 1961. They put an ad in the London Times, "The grain is back." That's scary. That is scary. See, you always wonder sometimes why some of these drinks did what they did. What were the big winners of Prohibition? Esquire's 1934 issue, end of the year wrap up. These same 10 drinks in the 1920s were considered to be the best drinks of the 1920s. By the 1930s, when they weren't using bathtub gin anymore, they considered these to be the 10 worst drinks ever invented. Okay, I do say Pousse Café is a little odd, but the Bronx, Clover Club, Pink Lady, Fluffy Ruffles, which you just had, Alexander, Sweetheart. Nobody knows what the Sweetheart was. I mean, literally, you can look in every single book in the world, you cannot find this drink, so it must have been really a disaster. Orange Blossom, Pom Pom, Cream Fizz. Most of these were gin drinks. Most of these were made with bathtub gin. That's the only reason they were considered to be the worst drinks in the known universe. But the ones that were born during Prohibition that did survive, and again, fascinating because a lot of them were made with foreign ingredients, brandy, rum. So you had Nacional El Presidente coming out of Cuba, Corpse Reviver coming out of London, Mary Pickford coming out of Cuba, Sidecar from France, Bee's Knees, French 75, Southside, Ward 8, and Dubonnet made it through Prohibition outside of the United States. Prohibition had done a wonderful thing. It convinced Europeans that it was their time. It convinced Cubans it was their time to create great drinks. And the bartenders in both parts of the world did eventually have their own golden age, which is the wonderful part.
Stosh, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to explain this today.
Garnish? I don't think so.
Only a night jar.
So that last drink you had, you did have a second drink, right? Oh, good. Oh, good. It was called Between the Sheets. It's one of those, another one of those fun ones that it didn't make it to the top worst 10 drinks in the world. But Between the Sheets, it was a great one because, again, it was a simplified sidecar made with rum. That's all it was. But this is one of the great things that we discovered is during the time when drinks moved from close quote American drinks to Europe and to Cuba, you ended up with simplicity, ease of execution, and at least good spirits. So can we do it? Can we say it? Should we say it?
Yes.
Good night, Gracie.
Guys, we're trying to fit about 6 hours into 40 minutes. So if you have questions, you can catch
We're
us
just going to be in there
afterwards.
all day, so we can
But,
just tell you
yeah,
the rest of the
we'll
stories.
be around for
Yeah.
any questions that you got.
Or you can look on Difference Guide. Was it 2012? We wrote, when they said, can you write a simple article to explain prohibition? The article ended up being 2 articles to a grand total of 8,500 words. So it's kind of extensive, but if you want to know all the details about what we were talking about, it's in 2 articles that are online in Difference Guides in Class Magazine.
A good point.
Yes, it helps. Because I couldn't even remember it all.
Okay.
Okay, we're done?
We're done.
We're done.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.